And we have as our first presenter the town of Aurora. Mr. Maracas? Please, if you have a seat, presenters have up to 15 minutes for their presentation. Any time remaining will be used by committee members for questions, and the rotation will start with the government on questions. If you'll introduce yourself for Hansard, we'll go from there.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today briefly about Bill 73, Smart Growth for Our Communities Act 2015. My name is Tom Maracas, and I am a councillor in the town of Aurora. I'd like to stress that my comments and opinions today are mine alone and do not necessarily represent those of the council or municipality of the town of Aurora. I want to begin by saying that the proposed changes to the Planning Act are a very welcome first step towards overhauling the current regulatory framework that governs how our towns and cities are planned in this province. I can tell you quite bluntly that what we currently have does not work, and any change that will move towards rectifying this current situation is a positive one. The time I have today is limited, and the proposed changes to the Act are substantial, so I will limit my comments to a few key areas. First, though, let me address what is not covered in the Smart Growth for Our Communities Act 2015, and that is the urgent need to limit or at least redefine the powers of the Ontario Municipal Board as it speaks to planning matters at the municipal level. As a municipal councillor, I can tell you that planning meetings are an extremely frustrating experience, and that's being polite, quite frankly. At every planning meeting, regardless of what is before us at council, regardless of how wild and woolly the application, regardless of how many requested changes to our official plan, zoning bylaws, or what have you, the elephant in the room is the power of the OMB to override what we've decided. There is an expectation, real or imagined, by everyone involved, from staff to the public to the proponents to even council members themselves, that regardless of the decision a council makes, it will simply be appealed to the OMB. The perception is we as a council have no real power to enforce our official plans. Hence, public planning meetings feel like a pointless, futile exercise for council, staff, and in particular, the residents affected. The Planning Act requires us to have an official plan. That official plan must conform to all of the provincial policy statements. It is submitted to an approving authority who, by approving it, certifies that our plan does conform. It is compliant. We have created, as a council, a community vision that incorporates the provincial planning requirements. Property is bought knowing how it is zoned and what our official plan says it can be used for and how. It isn't a surprise to anyone that buys property. So why then do we as a municipality have to defend that plan over and over and over and spend millions of dollars of taxpayers' money in the process when we as a council decide to reject amendments to it and uphold our approved plan? Right now, municipalities have all the responsibility and all the cost, but clearly we have no authority, and that simply has to change. We should have a say in how our community grows. We should have a say in how our community looks like. That isn't NIMBYism. That's engagement. That's commitment to our community. I understand that legislation that speaks to the power and authority of the OMB is similarly under review. However, I say that time is of the essence. And again, with the greatest respect, regardless of what changes are made to the Planning Act, if the scope of the role of the OMB is not addressed, then it will all be for nothing, quite frankly. With all that being said, let me get to my points about Bill 73. First, I absolutely and wholeheartedly support the proposed change to subsection 3, part 10, that requires municipalities to update their official plan every 10 years, as opposed to every 5 years, as is currently the case. Updating an official plan takes literally years of work, thousands of staff hours, multiple meetings of council, and numerous public consultation and open houses. And of course, incredible amount of municipal resources and taxpayer money. But at the end of it all, after the public's approval, council's approval, and in our case, the region's approval, what do we have left? an OP that is good for a year, 18 months at best, before we have to do the whole process again. That is not efficient or effective public planning. So yes, I support this change. I do, however, concur with the concern raised by others that we need a better definition of what constitutes a new plan. I understand that there is a working group being developed to address this, and I look forward to the results of their work. I also support the addition of a ban on global appeals of official plans. Many of us who sit around municipal council tables are familiar with this tactic. Global appeals tie up a council in hearings for months, if not years on end. So all the work and the time and the money that has gone into the careful creation of the most important planning document a town can have, its official plan, goes down the drain while we are forced to fight a frivolous, costly, and often ultimately futile fight. I support the proposed ban on appeals of both new official plans and comprehensive zoning bylaws by not permitting any proposed amendments for at least 2 years unless it is the municipality itself that is making the amendment. I also support the proposed change that would limit appeals on certain matters of provincial interest, such as vulnerable areas under the Clean Water Act, Greenbelt area, or the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan. I particularly support the proposed limit on appeals of population and employment forecasts assigned through the growth plan. I also welcome the proposed addition of the availability of mediation to address conflicts over planning decisions. It is at least acknowledgement that there should be an alternative to an OMB hearing. The weakness, in my opinion, to the proposed change is that mediation will not be mandatory. It will be voluntary. It also won't be binding. I don't think any party would try to exercise this option. And also, it reinforces the notion that municipalities have to negotiate the enforcement of their own official plans. It suggests give and take. I simply don't agree with that. Just who is giving and who is taking? Now, I heard this line from a speaker at a recent meeting of ours, and I think it sums this up quite nicely. Quote, municipalities are asked to negotiate the moon and forced to settle on the sky. Municipalities shouldn't be put in the position of having to negotiate away their vision of their community. Finally, I support the proposed change that would require those proponents that argue a council's decision is not consistent with or doesn't conform with a particular part of the provincial plan will now have to state clearly in their notice of appeal how council's decisions was not inconsistent or fails to conform with the provincial policy statement. This is great news that councils will now have the opportunity to review just what it is exactly that's being appealed. However, I am surprised this wasn't necessary in the first place. But it does lead me to my final overarching comments. The proposed changes in Bill 73, as they speak to limits on appeals, are a good first step. But they don't go far enough. I strongly suggest that appeals should be strictly limited. Actually, amendment requests should not be allowed to be put forward at all unless proponents can demonstrate that the proposed changes to the official plan or zoning bylaw fulfill a changing community need or in some way better our community. It can't be simply that proponents want to jam in more houses than the plan allows and then call that fulfilling the requirements of the Places to Grow Act. The cannibalization of every scrap of green space for Legoland-like housing can hardly be said to be fulfilling a provincial interest. Right now, municipalities across this province are being asked to review application after application, requesting amendment after amendment. It's planning by pieces. A little change here, a bigger change there, until at the end of it all, our official plans are shredded and bloodied, suffering a death by 1,000 cuts. Quite honestly, we are tired of fighting a battle of interpretations. But what is the alternative? Municipal councils are put in the position of having to accept these amendments or risk an appeal to the OMB. OMB appeals, as your own Ministry of Affairs and Housing documents state, are extremely expensive and time-consuming and should be avoided at all costs. Actually didn't say that part, but I think it's pretty much understood. And so we rarely defend our own official plans as a council because we can't waste taxpayer money on losing battles. Yes, official plans aren't carved in stone. There does have to be a degree of flexibility. Things change, situations evolve. But who gets to decide how much change is reasonable? Shouldn't that be a municipal council? I understand that there needs to be a body to which proponents and communities alike can appeal municipal planning decisions. But why does the OMB get to define what my community looks like? Isn't that what our official plan is for? Isn't that why we spend the time, the money, the effort, municipal resources to create these official plans to begin with? Any other decision by a municipal council is only subject to appeal through a judicial review. Why are planning decisions any different? They should be subject to the same process. Did council overstep itself? Was there an error in that process? Was there an error in the law? If the answer is no, then I ask you just what is being appealed. I believe the Planning Act should outline in a very specific and very limited terms the basis on which a municipal council decision to refuse an amendment to its official plan or zoning bylaw can be appealed. Our official plan is our vision for our community. It defines and describes the place we call home. But home isn't just a house. It isn't just some place where you sleep. It's where you live in every sense of the word. It's where you connect, build, and engage with your community. Yes, communities grow over time, but the drivers of community change should be the community itself. The community we have should be the community we want. That's smart planning. That's smart growth. So thank you, Mr. Chair and honorable members, for affording me the opportunity to speak to you today about Bill 73. I look forward to reviewing the response of this committee to comments provided to date. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor. We have about a minute per caucus. We'll start with the Liberals. Mr. Milchin.
Thank you, Councillor Marcus, for coming down this afternoon. And I know MPP Ballard's been raising a lot of these issues and how they affect Newmarket, Aurora, and including, growth-related issues like extending two-way GO service and how growth is affecting your community. You outlined a number of the changes in this act that will relate to how municipalities can strengthen and protect their official plan policies. Do you think that's going to save your municipality money?
I think at the end of the day, it's a fair question. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't come down to about whether we're able to save money. I think it's the municipalities in general should have the authority at the end of the day to decide on how their community should be built out. Each community is unique on its own.
What I was getting at is the changes to the process mean your planning staff will have more time to deal with a vision for their community as opposed.
Sorry to say, Mr. Milchin, you're out of time. And we'll go to the opposition. Mr. Hardeman.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And you mentioned the review of the OMB, and of course, this legislation does include part of that, and that's been our concern that maybe the cart's in front of the horse here. The part that refers to the OMB in this legislation should have been put with the review that they're doing on the complete OMB operations. But what is it that you believe we could do? You suggested that we have a judicial review prior to an OMB review on planning matters. Do you not have a concern that in fact would make it more expensive? Every time somebody didn't agree with it, they would go to the judicial first. They have no expertise in planning matters. They would then refer it to the OMB. Wouldn't that make it more drawn out than helpful?
I definitely think it would make it more drawn out, and I don't think my intent was to say that that it should go to a judicial review ahead of time. My point on that was that on most matters and most decisions that council makes that they are subject to judicial review if to be appealed.
Councillor,
but
I'm sorry
so
to
I was
say.
to say I believe that mediation is the best way to go.
Third party. Mr. Hatfield.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, sir. I assume you agree with the philosophy growth should pay for growth. Development charges you didn't really touch on, that some are discounted and some services are ineligible. Is that fair, or should growth pay for growth?
Well, ultimately, I did not go into depth with the development charges. I do agree with the statement growth, pays for growth to a certain extent, but my main focus here today was to deal with the Planning Act specifically. So I'd like to take a better look at the Development Charges Act, and I could answer those questions at a different time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members.